Thanks, Jessica, and thank you everybody for coming. Welcome to the Boston book celebration of the launch of Sheila Sundar's debut novel, Habitations. So let's just kind of get started by you telling us a little bit about what the book is about, and then I'll jump in if I think you've missed anything.
Yeah, please do. I miss things.
Yeah.
Is this, does the mic work? I never know if it's audible. Okay, yeah. Thank you. So Habitations is, at the plot level at least, a story of a sociologist who moves, named Vega Gopalan, who moves from South India in the mid-90s, in her early 20s, and comes to New York to pursue an academic career in sociology. She's a sociologist. She comes to Columbia University to get her master's degree. But behind that is the loss of her younger sister when she was 17 years old. And so this is the loss that carries her throughout her movement, her migration through the States, and kind of is the driver for a lot of the decisions she makes, good decisions and disastrous decisions.
Yeah.
Is that full? Is that
yeah?
That's what it's about, right?
No, that's perfect.
Okay.
And to add to that, it's equally funny and as it is insightful, and it's just it's a beautiful book, and I'm excited that you all are going to read it. But yeah, can we the book is really vivid in so many places. You know, it starts out in Chennai, it moves to New York. You know, it moves around the United States, back to India, the various habitations that he inhabits. And I think everybody would be curious, how much research you ended up doing for this, you know, and what exactly did you even research? Because some of the sociology stuff is so academic as well, right?
Yeah. It's funny, I spent a lot of time before I started the book. I don't know if this was procrastination or research, or if there's a thin line between the two, but I spent a lot of time reading the sociological works that I thought Vega would have read. Mm-hmm. And so I spent a lot of time with reading Indian sociological publications that she would have been immersed in as an undergraduate, and then I spent quite a bit of time reading the works that I thought would have been part of her study once she arrived in the States. And then I remember reading an article or an interview with T.R.E. Jones, who I know is one of your writing mentors, mm-hmm. and she was talking about her writing the book An American Marriage, which is an amazing book. Hi Lisa. And in that interview, she talks about how she was writing a book about mass incarceration and as it affects one family, and how so much of her research ended up on the cutting room floor because she realized in the process of writing it that she is not a sociologist, she's a novelist. And so I did feel like 98% of that research ended up being scrapped. Yeah. Because it's very hard when you sit down to write the book to not sound heavy-handed when you're trying to let your reader know, trust me, I've read all the material that she would have covered in this course. Yeah. But that 2% I think was actually pretty vital. Mm-hmm. And then as I was doing that, I also was sending lots and lots of messages to cousins who grew up in India in the 90s. And Nija is who's in the room. Hey Nija, would get all these random Facebook messages from me, what shoes did you wear? How prevalent was smoking? Yeah. And that ended up being a really big part of this, just trying to imagine the social and familial world that Vega was in. Yeah. So I really think that 2% of research gave me a certain confidence, made me feel okay, I'm qualified to write this, even if none of that really appeared on the page. And then so much of it was just trying to imagine how Vega was going to carry herself in her world, and that a lot of that came from the soft research of emailing her cousins. Yeah. As it's known in the field.
The hardest time. But no, as we were talking about some of the details of growing up in India in the 80s, 70s, 80s.
For her,
well, yeah, I guess yeah. Was there were so many such great details, and I thought the school was a real school until you just told me that it wasn't. Yeah. So what made you decide to write from the perspective of an Indian immigrant instead of, because you were born here, so instead of something closer to you?
Yeah, I don't ever feel like I don't feel like I'm in the driver's seat when it comes to those choices. And maybe down the road, maybe in later works, I'll feel like I can make a decision about where I want my character to be from or what world I want them to represent. And so I tried quite a bit to write a version of Vega that was US born, because it would have been a lot easier. I wouldn't have had to email my cousins all the time to find out what pants she would have been wearing in 1994. But she wasn't coming together, and I think on some really deep level, I really believe that's not who I thought she was. She was born in India. I did find, I made a small shift in the book where I felt like I wasn't able to access the fullness of the immigrant experience in a way that, in very small but meaningful ways. Like, I think that the weather and the difference in population density and all of these very, very vivid experiences, I wasn't capturing the way that I wanted to. Mm-hmm. And so as I came to know her, I made her life a little bit more migratory. She was somebody who had traveled a little bit. She had spent some of her formative years in the US. And so I didn't feel the pressure to put on the page a lot of those initial impressions.
Yeah.
But I just don't feel like I had much control over where she was from.
Yeah. Well, one more question I'm gonna ask you to read. So Vega, as a character, where does she come from in your imagination? Like, what's the seed of this entire novel?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of places. She's not somebody who, as an actualized person, resembles in any way anybody that I've known. But I did, throughout my childhood, I had the real privilege of seeing so many relatives come to the U.S. as international students or just pass through our home. Mm-hmm. And I was always kind of a student of them. Like, I always watched the way that they moved through the States. I watched a certain swagger, and like there was just something so badass, I thought, about like coming to the U.S. and saying like, I'm gonna go to school here, and I'm gonna have a seat at the table, and I'm gonna like, as you know, yeah. I mean, this is, you know,
it doesn't feel badass at all when you're doing it.
Yeah, it looked badass to me, but it just seemed like something that I wasn't sure if I would have been able to pull off. But I loved so much watching so many of my cousins, especially those who entered the social sciences. I mean, plenty pursued other wonderful fields, but I watched so many of them who came to the States with a real excitement over the social sciences as they played out in Indian society, come to the US and they decide that they were gonna do this hard work of sorting out all of the unfinished work of American society. And it seemed like the most incredible thing to do. And so there's certainly a bit of that memory, and that these people that were in my consciousness as I was writing Vega. And I wanted to write, I mean, we'll talk about this later, but I really wanted to write smart woman. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It took a while to get, a lot of drafts to get there. Maybe, hopefully I pulled it off.
Yeah, definitely did. Yeah, I think everybody would like to hear you read a little bit of the book so we can get to know Vega a little bit. Will you tell us about the selection you've chosen to read?
I will tell you about the selection I've chosen to read. So I'm starting at chapter 7, so I'm a little ways into the novel. And the things that you would need to know to make sense of this is that Vega, at this point in the book, is at the close of her first semester at Columbia, where she's been doing her master's in sociology. And she mentions two friends of hers, Halima, who's Pakistani, and Zamadi, who is Afro-Asian, born and raised in Kenya. And she also mentions a former professor, Sukuma Reddy, who's referred to as Reddy in this. There's also mention of Naomi, who is a former roommate who looms really large over the novel and over Vega's life. So, starting there. This is good, right?
Yeah, okay.
Halima didn't ask any questions. She had been using her spare bedroom as a study, and by the time Vega arrived, had already moved her desk and bookshelf into the living room. I was planning to rent it in the fall anyway, she said. You're doing me a favor. Vega filled her spring schedule as tightly as possible. In addition to her 4 sociology courses, she registered for introductory Arabic, because it was one of the few language classes in which there was available space. Halima patiently helped her with a script, praising her penmanship, even when it was crooked, helping her pronounce the letter R. Very, very close, she said. It's just a bit more guttural. Aside from the bits of Telugu that she tried to pick up when she lived in Hyderabad, Vega hadn't studied a language since her passive days learning Hindi at road school. She found it was satisfyingly mathematical, with none of the debate and friction of social sciences. She woke up every morning thinking of Naomi, but managed to put off her fantasies during the day. First an hour here and there, then the full duration of a class, the way she imagined smokers prepared for a long flight. One February afternoon at Morningside Grocery, she ran into Eric, a lanky white graduate student who had sat across from her in her Sociology of Industrialized Nations class. She had stepped in to escape the cold. He was buying a cup of coffee. Vega Gopalan, right? He asked. The use of her surname and the sound of it in his accent confused her for a moment. That's right. So, what did you think of industrialized nations? I love them, she said. I vastly prefer them to poor ones. He paused, then laughed. In class, she had found Eric grating. He had always sitting back professorially. When other people talked, his mouth was always slightly open as though he were waiting for his chance to interject. But he also struck her as legitimately brilliant. Once he had launched into an analysis of the Suez Canal so detailed and winding that she sensed that even their professor was a bit lost. Now she watched him as he tore open a packet of sugar and poured it into his coffee. She didn't find him attractive, but there was something appealing about exchanging easy banter with someone she once found intimidating. That night, she ended up in his apartment watching a documentary on the construction of the Panama Canal. I've actually seen this one already, she said. He looked at her sharply. Really? I'm joking. They ordered Thai food, and as they set out the containers, she said, you seem to have a keen interest in canals. Why do you say that? You talked about the Suez Canal in class, if I recall. Doesn't everybody? Doesn't everybody like canals? No, I mean history and infrastructure. Having an idea and turning it into something that shapes the world economy. She started to disagree with him, to explain that she was much more interested in the impact of grassroots initiatives than large-scale projects. But he had already turned his attention back to the documentary. After a few minutes, he pointed to the screen, a still image of Teddy Roosevelt saluting a crowd. Now that's a progressive. Regulating big business, strengthening the economy and pushing our interests abroad, not being afraid of a fight. The sex was the same as it had been with everyone except Naomi, exciting only in the moments leading up. He took too long fumbling with the condom, a brand she recognized from the free bowls in the library bathroom. Afterwards, they lay in his bed surrounded by his college hockey trophies and stacks of John le Carré novels. If she had been more drawn to him, she might have found those details endearing, an insight into another side of his character. But the room was dank. It smelled faintly of mildew. He politely asked if she wanted to spend the night, but seemed relieved when she declined. Zamadi began dragging Vega along to a weekly lecture series in Knox Hall. The topics were esoteric, with long titles punctuated by colons that Vega thought could be expressed more succinctly. In Pursuit of Home, how cross-border networks affect returnees' migration intentions. Emergent boundaries and identities, Asian and Hispanic pan-ethnicity compared. She liked to tease Zamadi about these lecture topics. On the selecting of outerwear, she said, watching Zamadi pull on her coat. Weather-related decision-making among contemporary African graduate students. But she found the event strangely comforting. She was particularly drawn to the types of subjects Reddy had flippantly called the soft social sciences. Issues not of life or death or disease, but of longing or statelessness. She listened to stories of Filipino migrant domestic workers, transnational adoptees born in Ethiopia and raised in the States. We're supposed to recognize how lucky we are, one woman said. We're supposed to realize that we were rescued from a life of hunger and poverty and unwantedness. But we have to acknowledge multiple truths. There is something missing when you're taken from your country. Days before the enrollment deadline, she dropped her statistics course and instead registered for a class called Race and Making America. As usual, she had little to contribute to class discussions, but the books drew her in. One afternoon, in a cramped corner table at Mac's Cafe, She began reading I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, going back to her apartment only when the cafe closed and finishing the book long after midnight, barely able to keep her eyes open, but unable to put it down. She returned over and over to the author's description of sex. I had not considered how physical the act would be. I had anticipated long kisses and gentle touches, but there's nothing romantic about the knee which forced my legs open, nor the rub of hairy skin on my chest. In the bathroom, she stared at her ashen face and red eyes, embarrassed that this page, of all pages, of all she had read about war and migration and health disparities, was the one that affected her the most.
Thanks so much, Sheila. That was a great selection. I thought it really showed off the best parts of your book.
It's important to know that I practiced this with Jennani
Yeah.
earlier today.
I mean, we decided what was appropriate.
It was really
to be
impromptu.
read.
Yeah.
But no, I think it really showed off the best about your book. I mean, it's like episodic in a way, but it's also very sharp, and your writing is so hypnotic that one just keeps going. And I think everybody could have listened more, but we should probably get on with the question.
Yeah, let's do it.
Well, one thing I did want to ask you, so Sheila and I met at our MFA program, and we have one of our professors here with us, hi Tracy. And
This is Tasha, everybody.
yeah.
Sorry.
And we have a couple of classmates and alums here. Hello. So I wanted to ask, what role did Boston and BU play in the development of the novel?
Yeah, I couldn't have written the book without this program, without the rigor of it and the camaraderie of it. And on a practical level, when I wrote an excerpt from the novel, I think towards the middle of our MFA.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a sense of Vega, and I had a sense of a relationship she starts somewhat towards the middle of the book. And I knew that I would never be able to start the novel from the actual sort of chronological beginning of it. I needed to find an opening, sort of an entry point into it. And so I wrote a scene in which she has this complicated relationship with a public health professor, and that was another one that I leaned on the soft research of emailing my cousins, one of whom is in the room. To find, hey Sheila, I was emailing Sheila and calling her. I was like, help me figure out what in the school of public health this guy that she has an affair with. And Sheila was like,
Why are you emailing me?
Professor of public health. That's also why. That's an important detail in this. And this is the soft research that you just added. And so I knew that he did something that was a little bit under the radar, and she suggested aging. I was like, aging. So he studies aging.
Cool, yeah.
I share that anecdote, I guess, to say that when I did decide to write an excerpt from the book that was kind of a self-standing short story, I was obsessed with the details of it because I knew that it was going to feed into a larger novel.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when you're starting things out, I think some writers are great at revising out some of these really fundamental problems, but I really felt like I needed to nail this short story. And I had the intensity of professors who cared about my work and the intensity of a grad school cohort that was, we were just breathing down each other's necks. And we were so consumed by each other's writing. And I had a sense that this was not going to happen again in my life. And so I had this opportunity to write something that was so good that the whole novel could stand on it, that I could write the book that I could craft the novel around it. And really, I would never again have a stretch in my life where so many people were invested in my writing and each other's writing. So so I wrote this in Boston, in my home in Cambridge, in the home of Lisa Stern in Cambridge, and where I was living at the time, and it was, and then it just fed the rest of the book.
Yeah. Well, cool. I mean, I remember that as I think we all remember that story as a standout story in our MFA program, and I was really excited when I got to it, and I was like, wait a minute, I recognize
Winston,
yeah. No, awesome. So a question for you is that something I've never read in another novel is that you very explicitly take on and tackle really well this Indian woman who experiences life or the world as like a Brahmin woman in India and all the attendant caste privileges that come with that, to basically losing all of that when she moves to the U.S. and she experiences the world as a woman of color. And I don't think I've ever read another novel like that before. So found that some of the most interesting parts of the novel. So what made you decide that you wanted to deal with that and delve into that?
I knew when I started writing the book that I wanted to write a smart woman who is a social scientist. But in early drafts, I could not make her smart. And she would be so just disengaged, and then she would walk into a room and then deliver some profound statement on social inequality, and it was so heavy-handed. And then I remember talking to writer friends about this, and one of them saying to me, the early drafts are going to be heavy-handed. Just let them be heavy-handed, and then you'll revise that out of, you'll revise your book away from that tendency. And so I knew that I wanted her to be somebody who had the intellect and also the empathy of a social scientist. I mean, she grew up in a country where the social inequality is so glaring that one can actually opt not to see it. When something is so prevalent in all of our lives, I mean, wherever we live, the social inequality is glaring.
Yes. And
we can choose to see it or choose not to. And I knew at the onset of this book that she was a person who chose to see it. And if she chose to see it in India, she was going to choose to see it in the United States. And I wanted to make sure that there were no boundaries around her sense that the world could be a better place. She was also coming of age, I knew, at a time when there was, when the idea that you could kind of donate or charity away social inequality was no longer really the way in which we were talking about social change. And so I knew that she was somebody who also had a belief in structural change, who saw that through the lens of gender and various aspects of identity, as well as caste, as well as race. But it took a while for that to go from something that was in my consciousness to something that was really embedded in hers. Yeah. And I tell my students, I teach at the University of Mississippi, and I tell my students often that if your character is reticent, your character is heavy-handed, it's just that you haven't revised enough. It's not that you're broken as a writer and your character is just going to be awful. Yeah. It means that you're on draft 3 of maybe 25. And that's fine.
Encouraging to hear.
Yeah. Well, you can't get to 25 without 3. Like, you can. And there are some things that you want to nail in your first draft, and I think that only we know that as writers. But there are some things that you just have to make better and better and better. And so it was after many, many drafts when I felt like I knew her on an emotional level better, that I stopped leaning on her beliefs and her position on various issues. She would sort of walk into the room and announce them. She stopped doing that eventually. I started paying a lot more attention to the nuances of her emotional life. And once I did that, her commentary felt a little bit more organic. It wasn't there on the page as much, and a lot of it was internal. She didn't say it all the time, is in the way that all of us, when we walk into a room and see and think something, we don't always openly challenge everything. We work through a lot of things internally, and she does that. But I also felt that the book stood on the shoulders. I mean, just like you can't write draft 25 without draft 3, you can't really write the book you want to write for this moment without the books that have been written for previous moments. And I felt like I had read, growing up and being really interested in immigrant novels and immigrant literature, so many great books about people, particularly women, who were really sharp in their native countries. And because they were coming of age in a less globalized world where ideas weren't shared across borders in the same way, their smarts or their political savvy or their cultural wittedness or their just intellectual curiosity didn't map onto the country in which they eventually settled. And so I really wanted to write a book for this moment. And this moment, I guess, starting in the mid-90s when she comes over, but continuing into now, when you're not locked into the political systems and beliefs and conversations happening in your country in the same way, that having a seat at the table in your home country means that you actually could pull up a chair in the country where you settle. And I was really excited to get her to do that. But again, like the revision was where that eventually happened.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting.
And it's also, we talked also about like, well, we can talk more about this later, but just how caste and race affect the book too.
I mean, we can talk about it now.
Yeah, we'll go there, right? So she is somebody who's very conscious of caste but in a way of somebody who is coming to it because it's so pervasive, because it's all she's ever known. She's coming to this consciousness in her 20s. And she is somebody who, when she comes to the US, she's aware of how caste affected her life, certainly in India. But then she comes to the US and she encounters a world in which her caste privilege in India also grants her a certain proximity to whiteness in the US, which is weird.
English educated and like
Totally.
yeah, middle class.
Yeah, the fact of having access to a fellowship, the fact of having had a network of family friends in the States who came by virtue of caste privilege too.
Yeah.
So that is, she understands caste in the context of India, but she understands it differently when she comes to the US. And I think for a lot of us who grew up here, caste was like a term you read about, like it was a problem that had been sorted through.
Yeah.
Like there were the pyramids, and then there was caste, and then and then there was the I Have a Dream speech, and everything was great. And then you actually realize that we, even second generation people, are still, we can live lives that are very much shaped by privileges or disadvantages that are inherited generations in another country generations prior. And so she becomes sort of aware of that, but then she has this strange experience where, as a mother and as an academic and as a woman and just as a human being, sometimes that proximity to whiteness really greases like the wheels of her American experience, and then sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
And and you never know when it's gonna, which I think is in some ways the experience of being a brown person living in the
Yeah. No, for sure. Okay. So when you're writing a novel, right, I feel like a lot of writers are always thinking about like our cast of characters, and whether to make that like really large or small, because small is easier to handle, especially if it's your first novel, but you did not go with that. You were like, I'm gonna go for the largest cast I can think of. But I thought I'd love to ask you why you decided to go with that, but I do think that it made it feel very true to life, but so what made you decide to go with a gigantic cast of characters?
There are a lot of people, that's true, in the book. Which is, what happens when you move through a place.
Yeah.
I have a couple of it. One answer is that I think one of the things that's really interesting about just existing, about being living in the world and living socially and vibrantly in the world, is that you are very much affected by a large number of people. And when they come into your life, you don't know what they're going to mean to you. And so a lot of the people that we think of as minor are actually profoundly influential. Yeah. And I wanted those minor characters to be I wanted them to be present in her book, because I knew what she didn't know when she met them, which is that these people are going to matter. Yeah, and so I did want them to be sort of vivid. And then the other piece to, so you know that going in, but like actually writing a lot of people, and our friend Val is also our BU classmate, and I shared an early draft with her. She said something about peopling the novel, which stuck with me so much. Like, how do you people a book? I mean, I feel like I've had the privilege of having a very peopled life, but how do you make your characters live that peopled life? And so some characters, once they got on the page, I knew that we were in it for the long haul. Like once Halima got on there, I knew obviously her family, I knew her parents were going to be figures in the book, but when she meets her future husband, Suresh is going to be with us till the end, and he's going to change a lot. So I held on to those people in my mind. I'm not much of an outliner. I much more, pantser is the term, which is a weird term. You fly by the seat of your pants a little bit. And there has to be a better word that feels like a very aggressive term, like I'm doing it to somebody else. But I'm just doing it to myself. But she meets these people, and I knew to keep track of them because I knew they would matter, and I knew that I had made them pretty vivid. And I think in general in fiction writing, when you make your characters very real on the page, you know that you're gonna get back to them, because they matter to you, so you feel if you've been out of touch with them, you bring the narrative back to them, you make sure that they come back into it. And then it's also tricky, even having a dinner party with 5 people is a thing that happens in life. It's much more common, or it's especially in grad school, like it's a thing that happens, but it's a lot easier to write a scene when you're having dinner with one person, maybe 2.
Oh, yeah, totally.
So it's hard to bring in multiple people, and I read a lot of books where there was a big cast of characters.
Okay.
I spent a lot of time reading dinner party scenes, or like I actually spent a lot of time in dinner party scenes and trying to figure out how these writers do it at a very, very discrete technical level. Like what's the order in which people are coming in the door? How is a character introduced that the other character has known, but the reader doesn't know yet, versus a character that is introduced who's new to the character and new to the reader. Those are very different. As a writer, those are very different introductions that you make. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about things like that, and I became really interested in novels about friendship and how writers build that world with lots of how writers people their stories.
Well, it was one of my favorite parts of the book because, I've moved around a lot as well, and I feel like in each place you do make some really good friendships, and they don't mean less to you because you've moved away, but it feels almost like when you're in the new place, other people don't understand about your friends from before. So I thought it was extremely true to life, but I had no idea how you were keeping track of everybody. So I was very impressed with that. I'm impressed you did it without an outline. But speaking of all the books that you read, so when we did our novel writing class in our MFA program, our professor Shafee always had this idea that he would tell us about a guiding novel, a guiding novel, a great novel that you read while you're writing your own. So did you have something like that, or a couple of novels?
Because She's in the room, I want to say it was Anna Karenina, because that's you'd always tell me to read Anna Karenina. So I'm not, and I swear I tried. I really did, and I like Anna Karenina. But the book that really, this has a happier ending. Just FYI. But slightly happier ending. But
slightly.
But I read different books for different purposes. So for the experience of peopling a book, I read and reread The Great Believers, because that's a very contemporary cast of characters book. And I would go back to Barbara Kingsolver and read Animal Dreams a lot for dialogue. Let's see, American Marriage was another book that I read for dialogue and also character description. And I read, there were a few, I want to say there was one great book, but actually what it was that I kept a stack of 5 books next to my bed, actually, what I wrote. So
wow.
So and I would read them I was so committed to them. Actually, I'll just list those books. I was so committed to them that I actually acquired multiple copies, because during my MFA I was going back and forth between Boston and New Orleans, where my family is. And so I kept spare copies in both homes, and I now have, I travel between Mississippi and New Orleans, and I have 2 copies of these books. So I have Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Animal Dreams, as I mentioned, An American Marriage, T.R.E. Jones, The Great Believers, and The Leavers by Lisa Coe.
Wow.
Yeah. So those were marked up, and I would turn to them for different purposes.
Yeah.
And Anna Karenina.
And Anna Karenina. So there you go. It's in their syllabus if anybody else is interested. So picking back up on something, you said something about how this has a happier ending than Anna Karenina. So one thing that was interesting about this novel was that I feel that the tone in the first half is very different from the tone in the second half. I felt like the first half it was it was sad. It was it was pretty sad to kind of go through, you should apologize. I know, no, it was sad to sort of follow Vega around, sort of in her headspace and stuff. And there was a significant shift in the second half, and I'm still trying to puzzle out for myself, what did it, what exactly was the turning point, and are you able to talk about that without giving any spoilers away or anything?
I think she became happier, and I felt that in the book. I don't think she's not dealing with a grief that ever goes away, and I really had to. She is living with a grief that I could not imagine on a personal level, and so I had to aggressively imagine what she felt. But there was a time in the book where I felt that she was finding her footing, and it did feel, and I didn't do this consciously, but I did feel like the texture or the shade of the novel shifted a little bit towards the end of her New York stretch, and then it gets, there's a melancholy, as it happens in life.
Yeah.
You have these good years, and then you have these hard ones. And what is the Hurston quote? They're the years that ask questions, and then help me out. The years that have. I thought you would help me out.
Nope, I'm so
No,
sorry.
no.
We just
What are you saying? Somebody, the Hurston quote, they're the years that ask questions and the years that answer them.
Okay, well, thank you so much. First one in the front row, really did not even plan it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she has those years that ask a lot more questions, and then she does definitely have years that answer.
Yeah.
And I felt the novel, the shape of it, the language of it, just how she felt walking through the city. I felt that change depending on the moment she was in.
Yeah.
And then I think towards the end, I hope that those are the years that answer questions.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you spent like a lot of time like under her skin.
Yeah.
Like in her brain. So,
Yeah.
so I'm curious why you decided to write it in third person instead of first. I mean,
I don't know that I write first person
Okay.
naturally.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm not gonna.
Simple enough.
Yeah.
That is simple enough. So I have another question. What was the most fun part of the book to write?
I loved cracking it open. I love that feeling like when you discover your book, and so those Winston pages, I really loved writing them because I really had to force myself to understand why she was doing what she was doing, and that was such a hard thought exercise, and that was when I really started to crawl into her skin. And then there are those really hard stretches where you're not sure where you're going, where you have this feeling that you're writing pages that you will scrap. And then it's really fun when you scrap them and you pick back up and you found the book again and you're back in it. I mean, there are so many. I thought of them before I was writing this as these wasted pages and wasted years almost, or months. I mean, at the culmination of a book, there are so many pages and hours and days, and sometimes for people years of life that are tossed aside in service of the finished product. And I thought, if you would ask me mid-project, or you told me that this was going to happen, or even ask me mid-project how I would feel about that, I would have said that it's just such a waste.
Yeah.
But they're necessary, and it's so good when you scrap what's not working, when you like cut out that bit, and then you get back to the novel and you're back on track with it.
Yeah.
That's always really fun. And then I think every writer knows you have some days where you think you should not be doing this, and other days where you realize that you actually should.
Yeah. Well, so tell me what your writing routine looks like. I mean, you're a professor, you have 3 children. A lot. So what is that?
That's true. Yeah. It's changed as it changes with different phases of life. I mean, right now my job has a lot of writing time built into it, so I'm lucky enough to be able to have writing days that are part of the requirement of the job, and that's a gift. And that's a gift that I don't take lightly. I'm very, very, I protect that time with an intensity that I think is a little obnoxious sometimes, that I don't take meetings on my writing days. I don't really answer the phone unless it's my mom. My mom will answer if you don't do it Wednesday. Everybody else, I don't. And so I'm really, really strict about that protected writing time. And then I have long stretches like between semesters when often my kids are home. And so they're at an age right now where they know when I'm writing, and I make it clear to them that I'm writing from this hour to this hour, and unless it's an emergency. And I can now. 3 years ago I couldn't. 5 years ago I definitely couldn't. 10 years ago I would have, I could not have imagined ever saying this aloud, that I would ever be able to just go into another room. But it does happen. They get older.
Oh,
And then I also spend a lot of time. I learned early on, even well before I could even have imagined publishing a book, when I knew that when I wrote more as a pipe dream and for myself, when I truly could not have imagined holding a book that I wrote, but or imagined it, but it felt like a distant fantasy. So there was but I realized that when I sat down to a blank page, whether it was a Word document or for the analog or just a blank notebook page, if I hadn't been thinking about the book, it was going to be a wasted writing day. And I could sit there for 8 hours and I would feel guilty that I hadn't been with my kids and that I hadn't been doing anything else, and then instead I just been sitting there staring at a page. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes that's just what happens when you're writing.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's a function of just not having done the work behind the scenes. So I spend a lot of time thinking about my characters when I'm doing other things. When I'm going for walks, when I'm just like, when I'm cooking, when I'm running errands, they're kind of buzzing in the background. And my husband always says that I'm humming when I'm thinking about them. So I mean, I guess that, he's always pointing out, like, you're humming, are you writing? And so I guess that, yeah, that's also part of it, that just so much of the non-writing time that I spend actually running in my head.
That's a really good tip, because I have definitely been confronted with the blank page wasted day scenario, so
Yeah.
no, that's a good idea. I'll start humming and see what happens. Yeah, that'd be great. I'm thinking about my novel. Well, speaking of another novel, can you tell us what's next for you?
Yeah. I am working on a book that is a story of a family in the Foreign Service that I, even though I have some understanding of the realities of that world, it's pretty narrow, so it does involve some research. But it is a story of a family that enters the Foreign Service shortly after 9/11, and they kind of bear witness to a lot of the political changes of about a 15-year period. But it's much more the story of a family.
Oh, okay. And your family did enter the Foreign Service?
Yes. I spent 2 years in Cairo. My husband was a diplomat, and I was working in international in an international NGO. So there's some understanding that I have that's based on that, but it's a pretty incomplete one. And also, you kind of have to imagine your characters far from your life, so sometimes the proximity is a liability.
Oh, yeah.
So I really have to, I kind of have to unimagine my experience to reimagine these people.
Yeah. Well, cool. That was, great hearing from you about your book, and I think we have some time if we want to open the floor up to some questions, if anybody's any questions for Sheila about this book, whether you read it or not. Yes.
You might have said this before I got here, but I was wondering if you could talk about the title.
Yeah.
That in the titling process.
Oh, yeah. If you didn't hear it, she just asked if Sheila could talk about the title and how she came up with it.
Yeah. I really struggled with the title because I always felt like a title had to be reflective of this one like physical symbol in a book, which is not actually the case, but in my mind that was. And so I just spent a lot of time thinking about it. I would have spend a lot of time with myself, saying words loud, seeing if they landed, trying it out on other people. And a friend of mine who read read an early-ish manuscript, I sat with her across the table and I named titles. And she was somebody that I didn't feel particularly self-conscious in front of. And I think that's really important in our writing lives, at whatever stage, at the ideation process, at the titling process, at the publicity stage, is to have people that in front of whom you are not trying to be anything more than you actually are. And so that was a real gift. So I would just say these, and some of them were just like ridiculous. So I just
Coming to America
spitball.
3.
Yes, and that was a contender. And that was a contender, but it didn't make the cut. So everything. And then I said this one thinking that I had listed so many useless titles, and then I listed this one thinking that it wouldn't land, and then she said, wait, pause. I think I said habitation, and she said, well, there are many. I was like, oh, I have a solution, I'll put an S. So that was how it came about, and I thought that it might change. I thought that my publisher would change the title, but they were pretty happy with it. So
no pushback.
No pushback.
Yeah.
Also, having it hyphenated on the cover.
Oh, so that was my question too.
Yeah, that was my question too.
Well, I think it gives it a dual, yes, because you have the bigger word, but you have the word within the word.
Yeah, I think it works, right? The
hyphenation.
I like that feeling of it, that there's a habitual pursuit, but then also she's settling into these places she inhabits.
And I was like, are there nuns in the story that could also add to the I was like, no.
There were not. Nonetheless.
No, thanks for the question. Oh, Jason?
Hi. Sorry. Question about the publication process for this. Was this the first book you queried, and how long did it take?
Oh my gosh. Has anybody else writing a novel and trying or like failed at it in the way that I had? I wasn't sure how therapeutic to be, because I think the thing that I wish that I had heard when I was writing this book was that all of those failed projects are actually really vital. They actually really nourish the book that makes it. And so I spent about a decade writing a novel before this, and I just decided it was not working. I practiced this conversation. I had breakfast with a friend of mine who's over here, and I practiced this conversation this morning, not thinking that I would go over it today. And I actually realized now, saying it for the second time in one day, that I'm okay. That I'm okay with it. And the first time I was like, God, I never talk about this, and I don't ever talk about it. I never talk about the first novel that just never made it, because it was really painful for a long time. And then once I decided I wasn't going to publish it, it was wonderful, because I felt completely free to take everything I'd learned from that process and write something new. And even now, like, it surprises me to talk about it. It's like talking about a bad breakup and then realize, like, oh, I'm over it. I'm completely over it. I'm completely over the book that I didn't sell. But I could not have predicted that at the time that I was writing it. So yes, it was there are a lot of unpublished pages that came before this. Yeah. Thanks, Jason. Thanks for bringing me to that moment.
I've heard writers talk about apprentice novels. Like that
Oh.
was your apprentice novel, right? I feel like you've talked about it.
Oh,
yeah.
Johnny Tremaine.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Hey,
Yeah.
Jenna.
Anybody
General
else?
question, I suppose. What's it like to share this book with your family, and you know, in general, your family is everywhere. And,
Yeah.
What's it been like to share with them? And have you shared with your kids? I don't know if they're ready to read it or what.
Yeah.
It's like.
It's funny to write this book. I told my mom this a little bit, but it's funny to write this book and be between generations, you know, because you have you have all of that in your mind as you're writing. There's a self-consciousness that comes from knowing that your parents will read it, and maybe one day your kids. And I really had to let that go. Really had to let that go. Because the book you write when you're self-conscious is a book nobody wants to read. I mean, nothing will happen in it, ever. So, because there's nothing we're not self-conscious about. Like, there's nothing I can think of that a person does in the world that does not bring about a certain feeling of vulnerability or embarrassment. And so once you get rid of it, when you have it, they can do nothing. Once you get rid of it, they can actually do anything. And so I really tried to, the uncertainty of publishing is actually really helpful, because when you're writing it, you don't know that the book is going to be successful. And so, like, this could become nothing. And, but it is strange now when somebody messages me and tells me that they read the book. I'm sort of surprised that, and I think I will be for a long time, surprised that the end result is out there. And it's just for your consumption. It's just for people to read and make of it what they. I can't change anything. I believe in it. I stand by it. But it's weird. I mean, and many of the things that we do, if we put work out in the world, it's very vulnerable. So. Thanks.
So speaking of vulnerability, you talked about workshopping the story at BU, and I know you had some rounds with your editor after the book was sold. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about feedback and how you incorporate it or don't.
Yeah. I think that when you put something in front of people that you really believe in, that's when you have to rely on the feedback. And often when you're working for a deadline, you'll give something to someone and you don't believe in it. And I feel when my students submit something and they're like, I don't love this, I feel terrible for them, because the feedback you get is not going to be useful if if it's not based on something you love and want to make better. And then not every reader is your reader. So now too, there are people that I trust with the book who understand the vision, and there are people who wouldn't read the most perfect or the closest to perfect version of it, because then they're not my target reader. I mean, I couldn't give feedback to some brilliant books out there because I'm not the best reader for it. So yeah, I think that knowing what feedback to take and knowing when to let go means that when you do take the feedback, you feel a lot better about it. Yeah. It's hard. I mean, it's like getting feedback on a world that you build, on a fictional world you build, is really, speaking of vulnerability, it's really, really hard.
Yeah.
And I think we talked about this, and I talked to writers talk about this all the time, and artists, I think, across media talk about this all the time. You really have to have people in your corner, people who get your vision, who get what you're doing. Beyond art, I mean, we need people who really understand the nuances of the work that we're doing and believe in it and are great champions for it. And once you have those people, then everything is productive. And when you don't have those people, nothing is productive.
So this book had a large cast of characters, like you said, and there were a lot of scratched pages, and you had your breakup book.
Mm-hmm.
Are there people or characters or concepts that you want to bring back from those pages, or do you think in your new book they'll just be completely new?
I don't think the setting would allow for them, and maybe it's I'm not ready. I picked a setting that's what I'm writing now is very contemporary. It's set not only in the U.S. but it's an American family, and so it couldn't overlap. But I think maybe in 2 books I'll be able to go back to it and and call him and get coffee. Yeah, just coffee though.
These are really minor characters, so I'm just going to tell you about them, but I'm obsessed with this couple in her book. There's this Indian couple that met during Peace Corps in Bolivia, and they speak exclusively in Spanish to their child, and I was obsessed with them. I think that they should have a novel about themselves. They're so minor, yeah. Yeah. Anybody else?
With all the people that you have in your book, do you find that you got rid of any that before you were writing you didn't like them?
Yeah. Maybe. Well, I think what I did was shift them a little bit. So one example is there's a very, very minor character. He's only on the page really in one scene. My character Halima's boyfriend during the years that Vega is friends with her at Columbia. So he exists in the way that your roommate's boyfriend in another city exists. He's very, very distant. But in an early draft of this, he was like a structural engineer or something that seemed like a sort of stock job. And then as I was revising it, I thought why am I not that it was a stock job. Not that it was a stock job. Sorry, it's a rich name. I just said that see, you can't say anything. This is the vulnerability. It's so terrible. This is not what I thought would actually be raw and embarrassing in the book, accidentally making fun of engineering.
This is what your family's been talking about.
I know. Sex is fine, but the engineering comments.
Yeah.
But he was somebody that I felt like I was doing a job that made practical sense in my head, and then I got to know him. I was like, well, what if I played with that? What? It was not the writer in me that gave him that job. It was the sort of surveyor of the world, and I was like, well, that's a logical job for him. He's kind of minor. I'll give him something practical. But then I made him a poet, and I also, and that was also playing with my own assumptions, because of course I've known plenty of, he's Pakistani, I've known plenty of South Asian and Muslim artists and poets, but I gave him a job that I almost assigned him this job. And I played with that little shift in him, and I felt like in doing that, and I think it could have gone the other way too, if I had originally had him as a poet, and then I thought, well, actually, I think he's a physician, because it just forced me to think about him with a little bit more humanity and think about his path and his trajectory, and really it could have gone in the other direction, but it was just the act of examining him as a very minor character, but realizing that our minor characters in literature and in life are people that they are people. They could be telling the story too. If they were the ones in the driver's seat, it would be another story. And so I gave him a different story, and in that I thought so much of the novel came to life, even pages he wasn't on, because I made him. I brought him a little bit closer to my heart, and I made him somebody that I actually believed a little bit more. And so I did a lot of that. Somebody who was quippy and funny and silly. I asked, what would it require for me to make this person really matter? And so I gave those people a little bit more depth. And so I don't know that I got rid of characters. Maybe in early stages I realized this person, or I combined characters that this roommate and that roommate could actually be the same person. And there's probably that, but I think more substantively, I revisited those minor characters and I tried to breathe more life into them. Hey, Leah.
Hey, so as you think about future projects and within the context of contemporary conversations about identity, would you ever consider having a main character that wasn't of South Asian descent or female?
Yeah, I could, but I also sometimes don't feel like I have that much choice. And so I think that maybe as I become a different writer, a different thing will inspire me. But I don't think I could have made Vega a different person. And I don't think my next protagonist, I don't know that I could play with her background too much, but I think probably somebody else in the world would inspire me, and I could step into somebody's shoes. But it is an interesting challenge. I mean, what does it mean that there's sort of this false understanding we have of somebody because we share like census classification, and that's not always the case, right? Like we can have a deep, intimate understanding of somebody who looks nothing like us, has a completely different background. And so certainly creatively I could see doing that, but I think the character would have to come to me, and then I would probably be able to do it. But there are also, I do think one of the reasons that I was able to, once I settled into Vega's world, the fact that I knew what she ate, the fact that I knew certain very quiet aspects of her life made the book in some moments feel like it was writing itself. But presumably I could feel it with a character of a totally different background too. I mean, I should find out. Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, we only have time for one more question. Does anybody else have a question they'd like to ask?
When I find the time to read, I try to like ritualize it, and so I'm thinking about this book and I'm trying to envision myself, like where am I when I'm reading it, and I'm just curious when you think about this book and the experience of reading
Great
it.
question.
Oh my gosh, I feel like somebody who didn't write it should answer that. Yeah, somebody else, where should, I mean, morning feels nice depending on your mornings.
I know, Brian, don't say
that. But not even afternoon.
Okay.
Yeah, I think a couch is probably a good place for it, depending on
What's
like.
a snack that she could have?
Oh my
What's
gosh.
a drink that
Yeah.
she could, yeah.
There's a lot of food in the book.
There is a lot of food in the book. So,
Yeah, I think something warm would be nice. Maybe something cool at the beginning of it, like yeah.
Oh, so we'll move.
Yeah, we'll move. Yeah.
The snack.
Yeah.
Like a cool.
Like a fruity, cold, juicy drink
at the start, and then we move
At the
toward
start.
like a warm chai situation.
I mean,
chai.
Chai is so not shy, Jennani. Not that that sounding generic, but the chai in the book. But maybe like herbal tea or red wine, depending on your warming experience.
Interesting.
I think something, being cozy, like something warm on your feet is nice.
Yeah, I would say definitely the second half of the book is it's a warm and fuzzy sort of thing.
Yeah. I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah.
She'll be thinking about that. Her next event she'll have like just like
It's a little vibe.
Yeah. Great. Well,
Thank y'all so
Thank
much.
you all
thank you
so
so
much.
much.